I'm a volunteer with Upskill Down Dales, which is a project funded by DEFRA and run by the Yorkshire Dales National Park Authority. It's a project which really looks at getting young people 18 to 30 years of age involved in the outdoors. And there's a whole range of projects you can get involved in, from dry stone walling, path maintenance, to more like management style, kind of office-based things. And it's an extremely welcoming environment that welcomes people from all different backgrounds, from all over the country, together to kind of embrace the outdoors and do what you like in it, really.
Hi, I am Freya. I am an Upskill Down Daler, part of the Generation Green project with the Yorkshire Dales National Park Authority. I moved up here 3-4 years ago. So I live in Grassington, which is just above Skipton, which is really nice. A big change from Milton Keynes. It's great.
I'm Aaron. I'm from Leeds. I'm 22 and I've always liked the outdoors, my hiking, my mountain climbing, and part of the Upskill Down Dale. It's a good way to meet other like-minded people and get involved and get outdoors.
Okay. I'm Charlotte. I'm from the Dales. I'm from a farming background, and I'm also part of the Upskill Down Dale.
So what is it about the Dale that you love?
The outdoors, the nature, the history, I suppose. Yeah.
You've got such a sense of community, particularly like during COVID, you get that sense. And it's so much easier just to go out and enjoy it. And it's something I never really did growing up much. But pretty much out your front door, there's so much to see, so much to do, so many activities going on. It's fabulous.
Yeah, it gives me sort of an outlet, I think. You can get away from it all and, enjoy the outdoors, and I think it's good for mental health and taking some time away from busy lives and stuff. So yeah.
I hope to get into conservation. It's a bit of a way in when I haven't had a background in conservation, and just get a knowledge of how the land is going to change with conservation as being a focus rather than the farming. That's a personal interest.
I think the more time you spend outside, the more I wanted to be outside. I couldn't imagine myself working behind a desk particularly anymore. And doing this like volunteering is a great way to experience as much as you can, from more practical stuff like dry stone walling to kind of more community engagement side. So a lot of opportunity.
My name's Laura and I live in the Westmoreland Dales, which is up in the north of the park. I'm a PhD student in landscape literature at Durham, and I suppose I got involved with the Yorkshire Dales just because I live in the park, but also it pertains to my academic background as well as my outdoor interests and just getting outside and seeing nature and the landscape for sort of what it is.
Yeah, I'm Leah. I'm from Switzerland, but I live in Lancaster. I studied there and now I'm working there. And I work in engaging students at the university in environmental sustainability.
I'm Lulu. I'm from China, and I studied outdoor and experiential learning in the University of Cumbria, and graduated this year. So I came here to increase my practical skills in the outdoor learning.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about the accent that's being put on more and more on rewilding and giving the land back to nature sometimes, some of it, or working with natural processes and regenerating them. I think that's really fundamental, both to address climate change, because we can restore peatlands and ground cover and tree cover, and that's really crucial to carbon capture. But then it's also kind of healing our relationship with nature. I think that's important to addressing climate change as well, to not see ourselves as being separate from nature, but we're part of it. Yeah.
I think for me, I come from a farming family. My father is a tenant shepherd up in the Westmoreland Dales, so it's a lived landscape, it's a working landscape. It's getting back to our sort of heritage in that we come from the landscape, but also we give back to the landscape, and it's that reciprocal relationship that I think I really admire, and that's kind of why I like being involved and like getting outside and seeing how people work the landscape for their benefit, but also restore and regenerate the landscape and look after it for what it is naturally as well.
I'm definitely interested in the work that that's being done about engaging people in nature and increasing nature connectedness. So that's kind of the people side and engaging people in nature, but I'm also really interested in conservation. And I don't come from a conservation background, so that was a really good opportunity for me to get some more experience. I've studied sociology and it's super linked, like it was really, really useful.
But it was almost, when we look back now, when that was actually introduced, that was delivered by the Yorkshire Dales National Park, called the Limestone Country Project. And when we look back now, that being involved in that is really what's changed our whole philosophy in terms of how we farm. And we learnt through being part of that farming, and farming in conjunction with nature, and farming for biodiversity was not only possible, but it was, for us, it was more fulfilling, because we felt we were working with nature much better, and we were starting to see biodiversity return to the farm. But what we also realised, that it was a more profitable way of farming. Then that industrial type building is almost not used nowadays in the way that we farm, and because it was actually putting animals inside the building, that's expensive. It's a long winter. It's all cost, basically, whether it's the feed that you're putting into them, the bedding that you're putting into them, the muck you're getting out of there, and so that all makes the margins really tight. So we've now got cattle that live outside all year round. We graze them in a way which we think is really good for nature. We do lots of work in terms of reducing our impact on climate change, and that's kind of where we're at the moment. But it was that Limestone Country Project that started that journey down a completely different route. I think why it becomes divisive, and especially the rewilding stuff, because I think, and people find what I say, I think they find it as a threat, and they find it as a little bit offensive that somebody's saying that what we've done for 70 years hasn't necessarily been right, and that isn't what I'm saying. I'm just saying time moves on, things change all the time, and we've got to be accepting of that. We're living in a different world now to what we were post-war, and we're living in a different world now to what we were 10 years ago, and we've got to adapt, and we've got to change, and we've got to farm for where we're at now, rather than thinking this is what we've done for 50 years. We've got to continue with that. I mean, essentially what it was about was producing more food. Yeah. and you could still argue that we still need more food, because the population of the world is still growing, and then there's a projected population of the world in 2040 or whenever that's going to be half as much again as what we've got now, and so there's always that pressure on to produce more food. From my perspective, what we've kind of done, and I always sort of talk about the last 50 years, which is 1970 to 2020, where the nature of that farming changed to such an extent, to using fertilisers, to using tractors for one thing, which are burning fossil fuels all the time, using pesticides, and we're much more able now to get into every single corner of a field. We use every bit of area now for food production. So the room for nature has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and we're using techniques which aren't great for either the environment or for nature. Farming's been, talking about my mum and dad in 1987 not being able to make money out of farming, and I know that the position I was in sort of 10, 15 years ago, farming conventionally, I know that I wasn't making money then. I was productive, I know I had a lot of income, but I wasn't making a lot of money. And that's putting subsidies to one side. So, for us, I felt we just had to change and do things different. And again, that was all experimental, but but there's no doubt that subsidies have kept farmers in business, and again, that's a massive threat. And you look at your balance sheet, and whatever it is you receive in BPS, which is the basic payment scheme, it could be 20, 30, 40,000 £. Take that off your bottom line, and it doesn't look that pretty. And so that's another threat that's on the horizon. And at the moment, we don't quite know what's going to replace that. In terms of, we've sort of talking about going down an environmental route and being paid for what we kind of produce, if that's the right word, for the environment, but nobody quite knows where that is at the moment. So they are in uncertain times, but I personally find that quite exciting. A, because it's going in a direction which I believe is a more right way, which is taking the environment into account and doing things for the environment, because ultimately we've got to do that. Otherwise, where are we in 20 years' time? I think at the moment, I think we have to keep in mind that things are just going to continually change over the next 10 years. I think that's probably just a sensible thing to do in business anyway, is to adapt and change and do what's right for the time. But yeah, there's no doubt that these next 10 years, 7 years or whenever it is, these are going to be challenging. But yeah, you know, like I say, for me, that's quite exciting. What I think we've done, and I don't mean to say this in an arrogant way or whatever, I think we've actually put the farm itself into a profit-making situation. If we go back to 2010, 2012, where we were farming the sheep, especially more conventionally, we were doing lots of work on the sheep enterprise, literally 70, 80 hours a week. And in 2012, I know exactly what it was, because that was almost the defining time for us. We looked much closely at our figures, extrapolated everything out, analysed each enterprise, and realised that I was doing 70, 80 hours a week, an income of about 80,000 from the sheep enterprise, but we made £478 that year from the sheep enterprise, from an income of like 80,000. So it was at that time. And then sort of like the cattle enterprise, which was really just there for conservation grazing reasons, and we just thought they were just sort of up on the hills doing their thing, that had an income of about 20 grand, and that was making 11. So 11,000. So, you know, he had these two enterprises, one which was just like really there for conservation reasons, but it was actually paying as well. It wasn't making a massive amount, it wasn't necessarily making us a living, but it was making a lot more than the sheep enterprise was, and a lot more per hour of time that I put into it, if you know. So what we actually did was say, well, we can apply the same principles to the sheep enterprise as we did the cows, which was to extensify, take all the cost out of that, so we weren't buying feed anymore for them, we weren't sending them away onto grass, we just took the cost out, and we only kept the number of sheep that we could keep on the farm without any additional costs. And that put the sheep into a profitable situation as well. But it goes completely against, and it's completely counterintuitive to think you're making more money out of less animals. And we're producing, and supposedly we're producing less. We're producing less as well, and so we're producing less food effectively. So people say, well, you're not producing enough to feed the country. And we go back to the previous argument, which is, well, we can concentrate on reducing waste and eating less rather than necessarily thinking it's all about production. What is happening on a lot of farms, and there's a lot of sort of evidence to suggest this is the case, so, and it was where we were at in that sort of 2010 stage, was, you know, we're making possibly 11 grand in total on the farming, but then we had a BPS check come in which made it up to making a living basically. So we were able to continue producing that food, producing an amount of food which kept the price of food cheaper. So that suited governments because there was less inflation and there was plentiful amounts of food being produced. So you can almost argue that the BPS is to pay farmers to keep producing food basically, and that's kind of fair enough. But what we're finding now, that actually some of the techniques that were employed doing that were damaging for biodiversity and the environment. So, and that's effectively why the BPS is changing, because that's a lesson that's been learnt over the last 20 years. There's areas of land, so we rent some areas of land off the National Trust, and actually when you enter into agri-environment schemes, there's all the land is monitored, and we know that from those sort of measurements that we're getting more certain plant species, botanical species coming on the farm. I mean, I'm no botanist, so I don't know for sure, but you do start seeing things change almost immediately, to be honest with you. From a botanical perspective, you can take the grazing off a field in the summer, which has always been grazed, and we've done this on a few different areas, where we sort of say, right, we're not going to graze that field this summer at all, and you'll get harebells in it, or local, you know, some of the fields around here we've got harebells and yarrow that particular year. And what that essentially is meaning is that they've been there for the last however long, they've been kept getting grazed and never actually been able to flower. But they still, and I don't know how they manage to survive, but they just sit there in the ground, and then when they get the opportunity they flower. And then, but it's sort of like a layering process, because you get botanical species and then you'll get pollinators, and you'll start to get invertebrates in there, and just because the sward's thicker and longer, you'll get that in itself is a habitat, so you'll start to get mammals in there, and they're feeding on the inverts, and then you'll start getting birds because of the invertebrates that are around, and it just goes on. But your botanical species come quite quickly, and then things build on from that, and that process takes a bit longer than the first bit. Yeah. There is all sorts of different advantages to managing the land in a different way, whether it's climate, whether it's air quality, whether it's water quality, whether it's the speed at which water runs off. When we went into the Limestone Country project, so that was encouraging people to get native breeds of cattle, and they were a breed that were suited to living outside all year round, so, and that was important to us. Essentially the sort of conservation grazing stuff is, and there's a field up on the tops, and that had been grazed quite heavily with sheep for a long period of time. So if we go back to the previous lot of subsidies, which were all headage payments, that encouraged you to keep more and more stock, basically. So for every, instead of paying you on an acre of land, they paid you for each sheep or cow, female sheep or cow that you had on the farm. So that was encouraging people to keep more and more. But what that did, especially on the limestone pastures, was that resulted in overgrazing. And so the Limestone Country project was about readdressing that balance. So encouraging more cattle on, more native breed cattle, and taking sheep numbers off. And so we didn't graze it again, we didn't graze it all through the summer, which allows your flowers to flower and set seed, and it allows ground nesting birds to have their eggs and the chicks, and it gives them a better chance and creates a better habitat for them. And then we put the cattle on in sort of September time. And the fact that they were native breed, so hardy native breed cattle, because they tend to be hardier, they tend to be hairier, they tend to be able to withstand the British climate better than the continental cattle, which had sort of come to the fore to a greater extent. Okay. They were able to live outside on those hills and graze through the winter, which is a critical period of time for the conservation grazing, because it eats all your rank grasses back and stops the grasses dominating completely. And then come spring, you're back to sort of a condition, basically, which allows the flowers to flower again. So instead of having a mat of grass like this, the cows eat it back through the winter, and then the flowers are able to go again in the spring. So what would normally happen in there, and will have happened in times gone by, is 1st of May, for example, the sheep will have been lambing there through April, and then early part of May, take the sheep out and take all the stock out, and that allows grass to grow to this kind of length. And then in July sometime, mid-July through into August possibly at times, that's when you come along and you make the hay. And in old times that just used to be sort of cut and bundled loosely into these barns. And you'll sort of go around the Dales, you'll see that there has been a barn in almost every small field, and that's what it was for. And then obviously as tractors came in and balers came in, you would make that hay into small bales, basically, and then that would be chucked into that barn as well. And if you just see on the end, there's a story in there, so there's a first floor effectively. So the hay goes into the top, that's stored in there through the winter until the winter, and then what used to happen is the cows would be put in those barns, tied up by the neck through the winter into what's called shippons, and then the hay would be thrown down for the cows to eat through the winter. So sort of like the daily routine through winter, morning and night, was up here, chuck some hay down into what's called the fodder gang, which runs along the front of all the cattle, hay into the fodder gang, over into front of the cows, round the back of the cows, dodge them kicking you as you tried to muck them out, and then chuck the muck out in little holes that just go out to the outside of the barn. And that was morning and night through the winter for probably 6 months. And my abiding memory of that is always Christmas morning, because it was a case of you wake up, you want to open your presents, but you can't open your presents till your dad's got back from mucking, going round outbounds, as we used to call it. And so you had the choice to either go with him and make it a bit quicker, or you had to sit there and wait for him to get back. And if you didn't go with him, it took him longer. Yeah. And then as that sort of started coming to an end, we were still making hay and silo, but we had the sort of that new, what was called the new farm building down nearer home, and that was much easier because you could get the feed in and the muck out with tractors basically. So that was an advancement, that was progress effectively. But what we've started to do now is, so as I say, there's probably, I think there's about 30 cattle on here right up on the very top, and they live on here all year round. So instead of making hay in here, we just leave the grass. So it's getting grazed a bit now, and we'll graze it an odd time or two rather than cutting it. And that's the deferred grazing that Laura was talking about. And if we need, and the cattle are stocked at a rate where they can sort of manage right through the year on here without necessarily feeding them a great deal. But if we get a really heavy snow shower or blizzard through the winter, then instead of making hay, putting it in there, using the tractors to do all that, so you're burning fossil fuels, etc., etc., we'll just leave the grass in situ there, and we'll just walk, and then have to carry the hay up to the cows to feed them on the tops, or sheep in on tops through the winter. We just walk the cows down here and graze them in there instead. So again, it's about fossil fuels, and it's about processing, it's about our time and the amount of time that it takes us to do all that, and the impact on our lives. So there's sort of like environmental and there's biodiversity reasons for that, because we still think that's a better habitat than it would be if it had been cut. But then there's also sort of social reasons for it as well, which is it gives us a, we believe, a better work-life balance than actually making the hay and then feeding the hay to cows through the winter. They can do that themselves basically. We're sort of getting to that stage where, you know, these cows can exist on this hill pretty much 90% of the time without us needing to be involved in their lives, and that's how we like it, but it's how the cows like it as well. You know, we obviously manage them, and we check them. It's not on a daily basis, but it'd be 3 or 4 times a week, but then that's just to make sure that they're in our fields and they're the right way up.